Hello, and welcome to Pickle TV. I'm your host, Amanda Kowski. I'm Gary's daughter, and I'm here visiting family, and Gary's asked me if I would host some episodes of Pickle TV, so here I am. Now, if you found our show on Facebook, YouTube, or any other video sharing site, please consider checking out our website at www.pickle.tv. It's the place to find all the videos that Gary will record from all the conferences he will attend. If you like this show and these conferences, please tell your friends about Pickle TV. You may also think about subscribing if you really like it. Now, on this episode, I'm bringing you another speaker from that emerging tech conference that was held in Dallas, Texas during June 2012. If you're not familiar with the Emerging Tech Conference, you should really check out their website at www.etcdallas.com. On this episode, I bring you Chris Gronlund. His presentation is the benefits of sequential content. Let's watch it now.
Everybody here okay? Yes. Yeah. As Tony said, my name is Christopher Gronlund, and I'm a writer. And that's kind of a strange journey for me because I'm also dyslexic. But I make my living with words. So when I tell you that if I can do this, you can do it, I'm not just saying that. I really, really mean it, because my whole life has been obsessed with words, even though they don't come naturally to me. I still struggle with almost every word I put down. I'm comfortable writing, but it's still a very difficult thing for me. But I found within writing a certain structure, and I'm going to talk about some of those structures today. And the structure of this presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of history lesson. It's not a painful thing. It's the shortest part of the presentation. After that, I'm going to talk about specific kinds of sequential content that you can use for whatever it is you're doing. And then, because one of my things, I do a lot of technical and corporate training, I don't like telling people, oh, this is what you do, and then just leave everybody hanging. I'll also kind of show how real life type thing that you can do using all these concepts I'll be discussing, and showing the story of somebody who takes an idea and makes it something. This whole presentation, at the end, you'll see it's online, so you don't have to take notes or anything like that. So let's begin. In the beginning, there were newspapers. Really, in the beginning, there were people telling stories around campfires, books, other things. But when it comes to content marketing, the newspaper is a really interesting thing for us because it benefited a lot of people when Daniel Defoe began releasing stuff. Instead of a whole novel, it was released in chapters. And that benefited the author because he was able to not have to write the entire book. He could write the chapters, release them. Benefited the consumers, the people reading it, because they were able to take it in slower instead of just one giant book. And it also created a certain culture where there was the demand for these stories. And people talked about these chapters as soon as they were released. And of course it benefited the newspapers because they were selling advertising and people were coming to the content that was being generated. Radio really changed things because if you think about reading, unless I'm reading out loud, and as a dyslexic you don't want me to, I can talk, but if you gave me a page to read, I would have a really tough time. But unless somebody's reading out loud, a book goes from here to your head. It's a solitary thing. Radio changed stories because now people could be sitting in their living room, whole families, and when something funny happened in a story, the radio serials, everybody laughed at once. It wasn't like I was reading at a certain pace and Gary back there is reading at a certain pace and he reads faster and he's laughing, and 10 seconds later I finally get there and now I see what Gary's laughing at. With radio, we all got to laugh together. And again, it was the same kind of benefit for everybody involved. The content creators got to create these shorter radio serials, so it was good for the writers, it's good for voice actors, Foley artists, it's also good for advertisers in the radio stations. Film further changed things because we started seeing longer narratives. At first, Sure, we had things like news clips and shorter films, but the neat thing, you had entire families now going to theaters and enjoying a shared experience at the movies. The other thing is, once you started having these longer narratives, these stories that people liked, there was demand for them, so much so that the sequel was born. Now, we could talk about Hollywood and sequelitis and how it seems that they're not putting out a lot of original stuff, but if you dig, they are. But even though I've only seen maybe 3 of these movies, it somehow happened, I don't know, but I've seen quite a few of these movies. There's a demand for it, and if they continued making Friday the 13th movies, people would still watch it. And the sequel is a powerful thing because now you have people who are listening to your story, and they like your story so much that they want more. They ask for more. And they're so big, you can sometimes pit sequel against sequel. Not saying this is a great film, I never saw it, but it was big enough that people paid to see it. Television, of course, really changed everything. Like radio, everybody was able to share the experience in the home. But here we began seeing a totally new kind of narrative come through, where film gave us an hour-and-a-half long story. With television, we started seeing stories lasting over the course of an entire year, sometimes more years, sometimes decades. I'm sure more than a couple people in this room have seen an episode of Lost. This is the kind of sequential content, not necessarily that we want to be creating, but the effect that it had. Even if you're not telling this type of a story, obviously, you want to do what Lost did. I've never seen an episode of Lost, but I know almost everything about every character on this slide because the day after an episode of Lost aired at work, people were talking about it. And all of us could really afford to have people talking about the content that we're creating. So all this brings us to the internet. No longer do we have to have a publisher, no longer do we have to have a station backing us, a film studio. We all have now a shot, at least for a nominal entry fee, to produce content that means something to us, possibly if you're selling something to a consumer, solving a problem and helping them. But we all have the ability now to share our stories for a very small entry. Now, there are all kinds of ways we can get those stories out there. Obviously, there are blogs, there are podcasts. A lot of people are having good success with video. It can be kind of hard to keep things in order, and if it seems like a daunting thing, we're all lucky that we have web content management systems like WordPress, like Drupal, Joomla, that kind of keep all that together and flying away. Sometimes it could be a little daunting when you start thinking about putting your stuff out there. You're going to do a tech blog. Well, guess what? So is everybody else. I have a writing blog called The Juggling Writer. It's not the only writing blog out there. There are plenty more doing a lot better than I am, but because I found certain things in sequences, I've been able to at least continually see my audience increasing. So the goal, of course, among them is for you to stand out. And the way that that's done is by creating sequential content. Now, Tony mentioned when I pitched this to him, actually he first said, hey, you want to talk at something? And I was thinking about this anyway, so it was just good timing. He didn't know what sequential content was. I can go ahead and give you the dictionary definition, but it's probably evident now that I'm not a fan of just reading off of a slide. And besides, really all you have to do when you're thinking of sequential content, it's really just ordered content with a little bit more. Now, a little bit more is important, and I'll talk about that, of course, at the very end of this presentation. Make you wait for that. But just think of sequential content as ordered content, and I'm going to be talking about specific types of sequential content, so it should make sense in just a few moments. But our job is, as content creators, isn't to sit there and make sure everything behind the scenes is lined up and that we have all our ducks in a row. People like my mom don't care what kind of server you're running, anything like that. They want to know where the ducks are going. They want the story. And you may think, I'm selling something, I don't have a story. But you do. Your product has a story even. Because as a consumer, if you just give me statistics, I'll say just please give me a white paper. I'm a technical writer. Just give me that. But what's going to really make me love what you're doing is giving a story of some sort, even if it's something as weird as a microphone. You know, tell me how somebody got over their fear of public speaking with this particular microphone, or just whatever. There are so many stories out there that are worth telling. So it's our job as content creators to make people care about the ducks. You have to make people have an emotional attachment on some level to what it is you're doing. Whether it's selling a product, or in my case, sometimes telling stories. Once you connect to somebody emotionally, and they can carry a bit of that with them, that's where you begin getting loyal followers. So the types of sequential content that I'm going to be talking about today, and it'll finally all make sense. I'm going to be talking about stories, a series, characters, which I debated, but you'll kind of see how even characters could be sequential content, the frequency at which we put our content out there, and of course, just good, solid writing. Stories. We all have a story. And again, even if it's a product, there's a story behind it. My story as a writer is the first thing I ever got paid to write was an independent comic book. And for me, as I mentioned, as a dyslexic, comic books were a great place for me to start because I could have a 6-issue story and my mind begins filling in the blanks. Then I take that one issue, what's the story of that issue? Then it's 22, 24, 32 pages, doesn't fluctuate, that I have to tell the story. Each of those pages has panels, and each of those panels has something going on in it. Yesterday I heard a lot of people, after some of the discussions that talked a little bit about writing, talked about being intimidated by it. But just think of it like that. Everything just goes into a place. First think of the big thing, and then narrow it down, and narrow it down, and narrow it down. And again, it sounds like the ducks in the row thing that I told you not to do, and there's truth there. Because ultimately what I had to do with the comic book wasn't that structure. I still had to make the person who walked into a store to buy a comic book that I wrote, pick it up, and care about the characters inside. I'm sure more than a couple people in here have read at least one of the Harry Potter books, if not all 7. Yeah, see, I've read all 7. And if you saw Sean Jackson's keynotes talk yesterday morning, he talked about the hero's journey. And he also talked about how it even applies to marketing. So while I'm right now talking about fiction, and I'm not going to just keep talking about fiction, but even look elsewhere for inspiration. Sean mentioned the hero's journey in Star Wars and Joseph Campbell, and how the same thing that made something like Star Wars such a success can make a marketing campaign same kind of success. We care about this character, this boy who started out terrified of this new place and ended up the protector of it. Now, we can laugh at soap operas, but they're pretty powerful things. I even got hooked on Days of Our Lives years ago. It's a confession. There was a character named Marlena. She's possessed, and that was so goofy that I had to watch it. And then there's Stefano and Evil Stefano, and I had to force myself to stop because I got so into the story. And I'm the last kind of person you'd expect to watch a soap opera. The neat thing about soap operas, and again, going back to that connection, that emotional side that's so important, I heard a story about a girl who had to go visit her grandma years ago. And she didn't want to spend a whole week of her summer visiting her grandmother. But as she was hanging out with Grandma said, well, it's time for The Young and the Restless. And the girl was like, you watched The Young and the Restless? So now she's excited. And she says, you know, Mom showed me The Young and the Restless. And Grandma says, well, who do you think got her hooked on it? And right there are 3 generations of people hooked on a story. If you think of products, even like soap operas, there are so many products out there that people pass on to their children and ultimately to grandchildren and beyond. Again, Sean Jackson, he mentioned Star Wars yesterday. That's something I know all of my friends, I remember my mom taking me to see it at the drive-in. All my friends with children, all their kids love Star Wars. The couple friends who have grandchildren, their grandchildren love Star Wars. Now, how can you use a story online? Again, I'm still talking about fiction, but on the next slide, they talk about something breaking away from fiction. Podcast is a great way to get a story out there. Some people, well, I'll get to that on the next slide, but in this case, here's a writer named Scott Sigler. He tried going the traditional route, and he had some luck, but it wasn't really panning out for him, so he decided, I'm going to record my story, and you're going to get a chapter a week delivered as a podcast. And over time, he started putting more and more books out. He started having this loyal following. Now he has that traditional publishing deal that he had, and so much more. So up to now, like I said, I've been using fiction a lot because that's one of the things I'm comfortable with. But there's no fiction with any of these podcasts, but they all still tell a story. And think about the story that you want to tell. In the case of The Nerdist, the first podcast that I got hooked on was Drew Carey telling his story about how he was on The Tonight Show, and Johnny Carson called him over to the couch, and how his life changed with that one action. And I was hooked on The Nerdist, still listen to it. Partially Examined Life is a little bit more philosophical, but even if they're talking about the subject, there's still a sequential order in the way that they lay things out. Accidental Creative, much like The Nerdist podcast, is usually interviews. And Pickle TV, you may not think, well, they're not really storytellers, they're just these 3 to 4 minute quick videos about technology. I'm not the biggest follower of tech vlogs, but I'll watch Pickle TV, and this isn't a plug. I don't know anybody at Livid Lobster except for Mark Ramsey back there who hosts a show called Tech Cards. It's just something that I like because I'm used to the sequence of, hey, this is what we're going to talk about, here's the intro, and then they talk about it, and what I really like, they're usually outtakes at the end. And you get to see a little bit behind the scenes. You get to see the people who are creating the content. And I know a lot of people say the content has to be for the people out there, not for you. And that's true, but eventually the people out there want to get to know you better. And with those outtakes and things behind the scenes, that's how you start seeing the people behind it, and you feel a loyalty because, okay, I want to make sure that they can keep doing what they love. So the story, I think we have that covered. You can see the sequence in a story, whether it's an actual story like something I might write, or if it's the story of one of your products. Series works very, very well online. A lot of times you'll see people just throwing things out at random. But what if for a week, and this may not work for very well-established sites, but if you're still small enough, why not focus on one thing for an entire week? Some people will say you'll lose your audience, but if you're still growing, it's amazing what you can get from focusing on a series, and I can prove that because on my blog, The Juggling Writer, I did a series called Queries That Work. Monday through Friday, I shared the actual query letters and the stories behind them that got me the initial jobs as a writer. And it's since moved up to second on Google search. But the good thing about this series, when people come here with the queries that work, they don't bounce away. It's not like they come in from Google and then they just read this one article. Since I did a series, lot of times I'll be able to watch that people came in through the thing about the novel pitch, but then they went to the screenplay stuff. Then they went to the other writing queries. Then they went to other parts of my blog. Then they signed up for the newsletter. So yeah, if you have a big, huge site, you may lose people, but this can work for you. Also, if you don't feel you have something that you want to do 5 days a week, the work in progress could be a good thing. And I'm fortunate to know some really cool artists. In this case, a friend named Ray Friendon. Every single day, Ray begins his day saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. He'll show a rough sketch. Throughout the day, you get to see it inked, you get to see it colored. If he has a messed up hand on a character, people have insight and they say, Ray, that hand looks bad. And he's, yeah, it does. And the cool thing is, people get really involved in the whole process. So when Ray finally has this released as a t-shirt, people buy it because they have a connection to this particular piece of art. Whether it's t-shirt, poster, whatever, they want it, especially if they're the guy who said, hey, that guy's hand is messed up. My wife is into historical costuming. It's more of a smaller community. It's not as big as a lot of things, but on the days when she's really showing something off, even though I blog much more regularly than her, she gets more traffic. She crushes my traffic. And it's because she's showing a work in progress. For me, that's a bit more difficult. I'd have to be releasing chapters and, showing my writing, and it's not visual. But I still look at things like this. You should still look at things even outside of what it is you're doing for inspiration, because the things that hook people, if you think about it, you can usually figure out a way to apply to what you're doing. You may be saying, I'm not an artist. I'm not either. There's a reason you don't see any of my drawings up here, because these would be horrible, horrible slides and this room would be empty. But another kind of work in progress site, I'mJustWalking.com. Probably my favorite site of the past couple of years, because it's a guy who had a job in New York, decided, I want to take a leave of absence and walk across America. And he did. He stepped into the Atlantic Ocean, dried his feet off, strapped on a pair of shoes, walked across America telling his story. But as he went along, people started following this and saying, I'll feed you, I'll shelter you tonight. And he began telling the story of all these people who came out, people who were driving out of the way to give him stuff. And 152 days after he started, here he is in Oregon, charging into the Pacific Ocean, and he had a lot of people, go back, he had a lot of people following what he was doing. This was taken, as Tony mentioned, I initially did this presentation for the DFW WordPress group. So it's taken over about a year ago, but at that time, he had 733 comments. If you think about people like Chris Brogan and some of the people out there doing some big things, they don't have that kind of comment count. I mentioned that characters are kind of weird when it comes to sequential content. Unless I'm writing a story, characters really don't matter to what I do. A lot of people use them for products they're selling. But even if you think there's no way I can use characters, and I'm not going to dispute that because you're probably right, you can still find certain inspiration from this, and I'll get to that in just a moment. We're used to characters selling us stuff. If you think about it, if you had an adult trying to steal cereal from kids, that'd be kind of creepy. Or if I got in your face and shouted, I'm cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I'm a big man with crazy hair and wild eyes, and that would not go over well. But if you make a cute little bird stealing or going cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, you can get away with it. Characters also tell us stories. The Simpsons coming up on 25 years, but the characters above them have been telling us stories even longer. And again, I really don't make characters unless it's in an actual story work for the content I'm creating. If I'm doing something for a client, I usually don't do a lot with characters. I focus more on stories and making either a product or the people the character. But characters still have an effect because they kind of change the way the web looks. And you may argue this, but whether if you're a good artist just doing, or somebody who can only tell a story in stick figures, people doing webcomics got kind of tired of that long scrolling block. So they came up with something more visual. Put what matters right there at the top, give the person an ability to move it without having to slide and find a navigator. And if you're selling something, throw that there too. Here's another slide from Player versus Player webcomic. You can see it has navigation, it has the actual comic strip, then it has a thing for new people, inviting them to learn more. You also can see, go straight to the store, advertising. And over here is a slide for Revolution Brewing in Chicago. No longer is Revolution or any site designed to be this long scrolling thing. Everything is there, just like with the webcomic. So as you think about what it is you're doing and the content, you also do need to think about the visuals and how it appears and how people are going to interact with what you're doing. This look down here for Revolution Brewing, so many themes now have that with the slider. And it may not be a comic strip, but in a way, the beer on that platter, at least to me, is a character that I want to know more about. Frequency is something that a lot of people, they begin something and then they give up. And they say that they just couldn't do it. And I understand that, yeah, if you don't have a staff behind you like Lifehacker, Gizmodo, or Boing Boing, it can be tough. However, there are people out there doing frequent updated content on a regular basis. John Green is a best-selling author. He's just one guy. He's a very busy guy. Chris Brogan, he's updating his site every single day, several times a day. The Nerdist has now grown. I could probably now move it to the other, but in the first one with sites that have a staff. However, in the beginning, it was just this guy named Chris Hardwick interviewing people and maybe bringing a friend or two along. So you can say you don't have the ability to frequently update stuff because you don't have this huge staff. I update my blog pretty frequently, and let's go back to John Green. And even a different way of telling stories, video. Some people may be familiar with the Vlogbrothers. It's John Green, the guy who's on your left, and his brother Hank. And they used to do 3 videos a week, now they just do 2. But they're creating regular content. Even though it's just a small operation, they're putting stuff out there regularly, and that's what we have to do. Because if I go to somebody's site, if Mitch is doing something really neat, and Mitch updates every 3 months, I'm gonna go away because Mark back there is updating weekly or something like that. The other interesting thing, if you're into telling stories and trying to make money telling your story, that's really all these guys do. They just come up with something they want to talk about and they make a story about it. That 250,000 hits for this video is not a fluke for them. They usually hit a 250,000 or beyond. And if you look, they have 971 videos at the time of this. They're running ads. Even if they're just getting impressions, they're making money just from telling a story frequently. And writing. Even in that video, you'll often hear the Vlogbrothers talk about how much they put into writing their videos. Again, yesterday I heard people talking about how writing is this intimidating thing. And as I said in the beginning, if I can do it, you can do it. And it's just a simple formula. You just have that headline, whether it's to grab a reader's attention or you're really thinking about search engine optimization. A strong headline, no matter what your goal is the first thing that's going to pull people in. Then you just introduce them to what you're going to be talking about, and then you break it up into smaller chunks. In my case, because some people laugh at me because I may just say, okay, that's a sentence, but I'm considering it a paragraph. Because I break things up frequently like this, I can sometimes drop something that's 1,000 to 2,000 words, and with those links inside, I can see that people are clicking on the things deep in. They're actually reading the content because it's laid out in a sequence that they're used to and something that they've come to depend on when they come to my site. So those are the types of sequential content, and as I mentioned, really does nothing to just say, hey, this is what's up. You want to see us in action. So I'm going to tell a little story about a guy named Weldon. This is Weldon. Odd-looking sort. He's not here, so I can say that. He's a very good friend, obviously. But Weldon's story is, it's his anniversary with his wife, and he's frustrated because he's trying to find a really good place to bring her to, but he's having a tough time on a city site trying to find something cool and different. So then, Weldon comes up with an idea, and he's fired up about it, he's passionate about it, so he begins working on it, and he comes up with this thing called Adventure City DFW. Now this is just a made-up story to illustrate the points, but so this is just something I made up for this, but if anybody likes this concept, run with it. See, I'd love to see it anymore. I don't have time to do it, but if you do, take the name, take everything, I'm fine with it. Anyway, Weldon's site is interesting because it's just like most city sites. You have navigation, he's doing ad swaps with people, he has his featured content, but what sets Weldon's site apart is the usability with these characters. In this case, Weldon wants to appeal to middle-aged people like himself. He thinks, maybe professional young women, kind of geeky guys. I used to be a geeky guy, young couples, and even older people like my mom. So when you go to Weldon's site, if you're a young couple with a child, you don't have to dig around and go to arts and then try to find child-specific stuff. You click on the Smiths. And boom, now you have your guide through Adventure City DFW. The Smiths will show you things, and it's not going to be just bland ad copy, because Weldon doesn't want to do that. So you click on the Smiths, and you go to their blog, and it's a story written from the point of view of a young couple. It could be the father, the mother, it could even be the little kid. It's written by Weldon or whoever he has helping, but it's written from the point of view of the character, and it helps people navigate to things that actually matter to them quickly without having to dig. So Weldon goes through, and the Smiths, they also have their reviews, the itinerary, and again, it's just sequential content. It's, hey, here's our day in Grapevine. Before it got too hot, we were at the Botanical Gardens, then we went to the Nash Farm, and the whole day is there, but it's written from the point of view of the characters, so families are like, man, that little kid Susie's having fun. I can take my kid and do the same thing. So Weldon comes up with this idea, and of course, he follows all the metrics and that, and everything's looking good. And then he finds out that people really love the Joneses. He was right, middle-aged couples like this, because they just click on this, and they get this couple's adventure. And Weldon one day gets email from somebody saying, my wife and I, we love the Joneses, and we'd love to see you branch out to doing day trips. So Weldon was like, well, that's a good timing because my wife and I are going to Granbury this weekend. And so going to Granbury, and when he comes back, he decides, I'm going to write it from the point of view of the Joneses, and it goes over so well that he decides, I have friends in other parts of Texas. Why don't I get on the phone and call one of my friends? I'll call my friend Peter in Austin. It just so happens that Peter looks an awful lot like me when he had shorter hair. But he calls Peter, and he tells him a plan. He says, I've got Dallas covered with the stories about these characters and the way I lay everything out, and people really like it. So why don't you do it in Austin? And Peter does, and it works. So Weldon keeps going. Why not? He hasn't been stopped. And now he's all over Texas. He knows people in other states. So why not give a friend in Chicago a call and say, why don't I try Adventure City, Chicago? And it works there too. And once something begins working, you just never know where it's going to go. Truly, you never know. Maybe Adventure City, Paris. Maybe Adventure City, London. You have to believe in what you're doing. And if you talk to anybody who's a huge success, usually somewhere in the beginning, they're like, we didn't know it was going to work. We didn't know it was going to be this big. We didn't know it was going to be worldwide. So Weldon's a very happy guy because he's been able to use sequential content to do a job well done. Now again, I just kind of showed you that, but let's actually analyze what exactly Weldon did to make this site a success. He told stories. He didn't just have plain old copy. When you went to his site, the characters told the story. And he could even have characters interacting with other characters, not just in a specific area, but in other states. Weldon used the series. With his character William, the IT guy, he's always working, so he can't really travel that much because he's always doing late night installs, clients are always calling him, and he loves ethnic food. So instead of having William go around the world, at least right now, he has him going around the mid-cities to Papaya Garden in Euless or El Wadi in Bedford. He has this whole series that people get into and see, wow, I didn't even know these places existed. Characters. Obviously, in Weldon's case, he has the characters covered. And the frequency at which he puts things out, initially Weldon thinks, I'm doing too much. But the truth is, with where he's doing his thing, the DFW Metroplex, Weldon can't create enough content. He can't create things frequently enough to satisfy over 6.3 million people. And of course, he has just good, plain, beginning, middle, and ending writing covered as well. This is what sequential content is. This is what Tony didn't know what I was talking about at first, and now does, and I hope that you guys now know. And earlier, I mentioned that thing that sequential content is simply ordered content with a little something more. That little something more is the most important thing, because that little something more is the fuel for one's tenacity. That little something more is passion. And passion is what makes us keep going. I've been a juggler for 31 years because I'm passionate about it. In a week and a half, I get to celebrate being with my wife for 20 years because I'm passionate about our relationship. I mentioned that I write novels. All my friends in publishing work with genre fiction. I like genre fiction, I write it occasionally, but my true passion when it comes to being a novelist is contemporary fiction. So I've chosen to write what doesn't pay over what I can do because that passion is what matters. If I don't do what I love, I'm doing myself, I'm doing everybody who reads something I write a grave disservice. If I ask somebody over here, putting it to the sites that we all make, hey, what are you doing? And he says, I want to make a lot of money with a tech blog. And I've got this idea of, looking at other tech blogs. I'm going to do what they did to make money, and I'm going to make money, and if I don't make money, in 3 to 4 months, I think I'm going to start selling Amway. I'm not going to that guy's site, I'm sorry. But if I go over here and I ask somebody what they're doing, and she says, I'm doing a tech blog, and she's passionate about it, and that transfers to me, and she breaks down succinctly what it is she's doing that makes her site different, and the types of technology that I'm not really into, but now I am, I'm going to her site. If Tony gave me $1,000, that's a nice thought, isn't it, Tony? Give me $1,000 to bet on this person's success or the success of the person who's passionate about tech. I'm putting my money on her. But it doesn't have to be something even big like technology. If I ask somebody back here, what are you really into? And they say, I really like bearded lizards. They have my attention because when's the last time I've chatted with somebody about bearded lizards? But if they're excited about it and they tell me their story, and that their story is, I have a bearded lizard named Sydney, and I have a blog, it started a year ago, from Sydney's point of view. And it became a success among people who like bearded lizards. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, this is kind of cool, but I'll just let him talk because I'm starting to get a little frightened. But then he starts saying, and other people started coming who have other kinds of reptiles. And I thought, why not have a forum? And that grew into some ads. And then the guy tells me, you know what's really cool is I took this hobby and now it's something more, because now I run Reptilorama, which is poised to become the internet's place for all things reptile. Now his passion has transferred to me, and I might find myself putting 20 years of marriage to the test when I go to my wife and I say, I have a box in my hand, and she asks me what's in there, and I say, bearded lizards? Aren't they cute? That's passion. That's what we have to keep things going. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that life is this short thing, but I am going to stand here and tell you that life isn't long enough to be doing the things in life you don't want to be doing. So do what you're passionate about. Do what you love, even if it's not going to be the big moneymaker you think it is, because it just might surprise you. My name's Christopher Gronlund. I hope my passion for sequential content has come through. I also like helping people, so I hope that everybody here, or at least a handful, leaves thinking about the content they create in a different way. Thank you. And there's the slide share for anybody who wants to see all this.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed this week's session. Make sure to come back next week for another video from the Emerging Tech Conference. If you like what Pickle TV is doing, I would ask you to consider dilldomains.com the next time you buy a domain name or website hosting. Dilldomains.com is my daddy's GoDaddy reseller account, plain and simple. So if you like GoDaddy, or if you use GoDaddy, please consider using Dill Domains instead. In other words, buy your GoDaddy stuff from my daddy. Well, that's all for today. So until next week, this is your host, Amanda Kalski, saying goodbye and thanks for watching.